Okay, so just to kind of recap, I was talking about how essentially I was addressing to you that a fact that many of you may not know is that the creation of Israel is a very recent event. And just to clarify back what I was saying here, in the book War and Peace in the Middle East by Avi Schlein, um, he says Britain's policy in Palestine provoked fierce Arab hostility. In 1920, Britain set up a civil administration headed by a high commissioner to govern the country directly, and the League of Nations incorporated into its mandate a promise, basically to support a Jewish national home. At this time, Jews constituted about 10% of Palestine's population. Okay, and so that was roughly around 1920. So again, um, many of you may not realize um, how little of the Jewish population even lived in Palestine. But then we get all the way up into 1948, where there's enough Jews, mainly coming from Europe, that are going to be in Palestine, which is now Israel. Have the British will leave basically with their tail between their legs, not able to control a lot of the tensions between Jews and Arabs, and the Arabs seem like they should be able to win, but in fact, those armies lose. Now, um, it's a long set of explanations about how we got there and to why they lost and why the Jews won. It's not as miraculous as it may seem when you look at modern historians, even coming out of Israel, as to why that happened, how well organized the Jews were and how not well organized the Arabs were. But regardless of that, the Jews had an astounding victory. And when I said that Palestinians were expelled, about 500,000, um, there's that is what the consensus of modern, even Israeli historians agree to. There has been a traditional story, that a myth, that the Arabs told the Palestinians to leave their homes so they could kill all the Jews and then go back to their homes, and that's been pretty much abolished by all serious historians on the subject. Um, just making that clear. But in any case, regardless of even what that means to us, I want to talk about how this applies to U.S. history. So now I told you that the Soviet Union was one of the first to acknowledge Israel. And there seems to be a wide range of different reasons why that was. And I'm not going to fully explore all of those, but just to say this, you know, Israel potentially looked like it could be a socialist state. The founding party of Israel was actually a socialist one. It's not religious Jews who helped create Israel. In fact, many of them were even atheists, believe it or not. And some were avowed Marxists and communists. Um, Keep in mind that the trend of this time period all around the world was liberal capitalist democracy, uh, communism, and fascism. And Jews in Palestine took on the trends that came from Europe, and they embraced many of the trends that um, were common in Europe. And Israel creates itself based on a European model, um, mixed with making a Jewish theocracy in one sense, but not really. It's a complicated system. But the bottom line is, as Israel gets created, Palestinians flee in refugee camps. And if you look right here, right, okay, so Israel is going to be created, remember, 1948, and we're going to see Jordan here, and there's Syria, Lebanon, here's Beirut, here's Damascus, okay, and then here is big, vast desert area, and then here's Egypt, okay? So maps always help. And then so if you look at the broader map here, look, here's Iraq, Saudi Arabia is here, and then you have Iran, and then the Soviet Union is up here, okay, and here's Turkey. Afghanistan is way over here. Do you see where Afghanistan is? But the Soviet Union is going to cover all this top part here, okay? And so we'll get to reasons later why that's like significant. Now, it essentially ends up happening that Israel is not going to be in the Soviet camp. It's going to be in the West, and ultimately, I mean, in terms of relationships with the West as a buffer against Soviet interests. Okay, and another country in the region is also going to be doing the same thing, which is Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is really anti-communist, okay? And they have lots of oil. And there's a fear. Look how much closer the Soviet Union is to the Middle East than us, right? But Israel represents something that is very fresh in the minds of all the Arabs in the Middle East. And not everybody in the Middle East is even Arab, by the way, and not everybody in the Middle East is Muslim, okay? But they see Israel as a modern European colonialist adventure where Jewish Europeans are going to take over Arab Muslim land, and that they think that it should be removed, okay? Now, again, this is a modern conflict, not an ancient one. This is a conflict by a state created by European Jews. And if you look in history, Jews have often were treated better, it's a whole long story, in the Middle East. The Middle East had huge Jewish populations. Iraq, actually, the Baghdad is where the Talmud that comes from that part, the Babylonian Talmud, is still the most authoritative Jewish text. Not in Saudi Arabia, but Egypt had a long Jewish population going back since biblical times. The first translation of the Bible in Greek comes from Egypt, okay? But this modern conflict is going to really bring Arab-Jewish relations at an all-time low. Many Jews from Middle Eastern countries and African countries are going to be expelled as a response to the expulsion of Palestinians being expelled. And Israel will eventually end up absorbing those Jews into the state. And the Arabs will not absorb most of the refugees from Palestine. Now, again, this is not a lecture on the complexities of the Middle East, but what we need to understand is that the U.S. then starts to take a role in the Middle East, and it's going to be a very important policy for the United States to get involved for several sets of reasons. One, oil. You see all the oil there. This is a resource. Where there's resources and you have superpowers, you want to control resources. The Soviet Union also was interested in this part of the world, and believe it or not, communism was actually popular as an ideology and other various forms of nationalism and socialism within the broader Arab and Islamic world, okay? And again, Saudi Arabia and Israel were used by the U.S. government in many military operations, often covert, not like on the map, to try to fight off these trends that were seen to be in favor of the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union is going to try to favor certain regimes in this region, and then the West, with its allies, it's going to try to also get involved. Now, Israel has more wars with the Arabs in which the Arabs keep losing and they're humiliated, and eventually the Arabs will get an upper hand over Israel a little bit, and there's Israel gets more and more land, which they still have much of that land now, okay? And the response, as we talked about at the beginning of the first lecture, is with the U.S. supporting Israel, deciding that they were going to be so supportive, especially by this time, the oil embargo ends up getting put on the United States and drastically affects things. And that really upsets many Americans. Okay, and so this is where the Middle East conflict, probably one of the first times that we really start seeing how U.S. foreign policy, who we're backing, and what's going on over there is going to affect U.S. consumers in a negative way. And of course, some will blame the U.S. relationship with Israel. Some of them will blame it on the Arabs. And ultimately, I'm not going to resolve the blame game here, but simply to show that this is where we're seeing a strong relationship in the region. Keep in mind that there is a certain amount of peace that eventually Carter, as it says, is going to make between some of the Arab states. So Egypt, who ends up originally being an enemy of Israel, will be the first Arab Muslim nation to acknowledge it from the state's point of view. Okay, the military state, Anwar Sadat. And to this day, Israel is the largest military aid recipient of the U.S. government, and Egypt is second, based on its promise not to attack Israel. So two of our largest military aid recipients in the region go to these two. Now, something to keep in mind, that for everybody in this region, from the ground up to the leaders, everybody knows the strong relationship that the U.S. has with Israel, and they also know that the U.S. supports the regimes of Saudi Arabia and Egypt. And our involvement there has a set of contradictory objectives, or at least it's seen nowadays. But at the time, it was more consistent. Essentially, again, if you remember, I was saying that the U.S. is trying to push back anything that would give the USSR a favorable position or a foothold. Okay, so we're going to support regimes in the region that are in any way not to the favor of the USSR. Now, again, Israel and Saudi Arabia are not friends and they don't get along, but we've actually supported them for many of the same reasons. Now, Saudi Arabia had the oil and Israel didn't, but they've both been allies in supporting military operations against Soviet interests. Okay, and then various regimes in Iran and Iraq have been pro-US or anti-US, depending on who came to power. Syria has pretty much remained in the Soviet sphere. And this is also why Russia, Putin's access and his relationship with Assad now in Syria, if you've been following what's been going on there now, has remained relatively consistent. Okay, and so in any case, I'm going to end this lecture here. I'm going to kind of start showing you some other documentary clips. I want to try to address some other things that are in the textbook. And I'm hoping, if you're just a little bit confused right now, that by the end of this, you can kind of at the very least see how we've got to where we're at currently in the world.